Hi, I'm James Chew. I am a narrative designer at Failbetter Games. For those of you who don't know us, we're a small independent studio in London. We've been making games since 2009, and we have kind of games in the shared universe, the Fallen London universe. And one of our games, Fallen London, the premise is London in the 1850s was stolen by giant space bats. To clarify with the giant, because normal bats would be ridiculous. In our most recent game, Sunless Skies, we took that premise and took the Victorians into space. Before I was a narrative designer, I was a student of medieval history at the University of St Andrews in Scotland. So thinking about history and using history in narrative design is something I do a lot as my day job. So first off, well, there's the Fallen London universe, as you can see, a large bat. Why history? Two reasons. One is that history as a tool of inspiration for writers is enormously useful. We find kind of stories and inspiration and references and ideas that we just wouldn't have come up with ourselves through kind of mining the historical record for our own inspiration and for our own stories. They can lend kind of depth and realism to the kind of stories we tell. But also, in terms of creating a game setting for your players, being able to kind of show a rich, detailed game history, a detailed backstory for your game can kind of make the setting feel rich and authentic in a way that kind of really kind of helps the player immerse themselves in the setting. So my definitions here for history, I'm using it in two senses in this talk, one of which is real history for a given value of real, using it in terms of the historical record, things that happened in our world, that's real history. And then game history is game backstory, that's everything that happened to your game world before the player started loading up your game and interacting with it. So the kind of points I want to go through here are, one is just to discuss history as narrative, and kind of history is something that we can be in control of. We can be empowered to use it in our games. And then looking at choosing real history and the kind of considerations when it comes to choosing a setting for a game if you're making a historical game, or if you're using history as a reference point or something to kind of draw world building from. And looking at kind of managing player expectations when it comes to using history in games, kind of what might they think of your game, what kind of things will they bring to a setting set in a specific period of history. And then looking at getting subversive, looking at kind of changing bits of history, kind of diverting from the player expectations, why you might want to do that, how to do that. Then finally looking at kind of real history as a reference for world building. And then my final point is going to be on making game history relevant to your players, making the backstory of your game relevant to your players. So first off, let's shoot the elephant in the room. Can you make a historically accurate game? The answer is no. The reason for that I'm going to demonstrate through a couple of sources taken from the historical record. These sources are all from ancient Byzantium, medieval Byzantium specifically. For those who don't know, Byzantium was capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. After the Roman Empire fell, for a given value of fell, it continued for about 1,000 years thereafter, ruled by emperors, and had a kind of fractious relationship with the West. This first source, I won't read it all out because it's quite long-winded, is from Procopius, who was a core historian to the Emperor Justinian. The key point here is he's praising Justinian for kind of his legal reforms, his statecraft, the way he models himself on a Roman emperor, and the continuity that represents. And Procopius is, well, he's praiseworthy here. He has a different document called The Secret History, which I'm not going to get into, which is a much more entertaining read, but was not published in his lifetime. So Procopius is quite complex. This one is from Liutprand of Cremona. It's a few centuries later. Liutprand of Cremona is one of history's most spectacularly energetic haters. He hated absolutely everything he came into contact with, and wrote kind of long texts, kind of complaining and being very, very insulting towards everyone he encountered. In this particular instance, for some reason, he's been sent to Byzantium as a diplomat. to present a marriage treaty between the Holy Roman Emperor and the Greek Emperor's daughter. And here he is not impressed by what he finds. He kind of ridicules the kind of processions, the Byzantine way of dressing themselves, the kind of way of presenting themselves, the kind of pretensions, as he sees it, to imperial Rome. I would highly recommend reading the whole thing in full. He gets kind of trapped in kind of an embassy with no roof, and kind of all the monks are there kind of shivering in their habits as the rain comes through the roof. As I say, quite a complex character. And our final source is from the late 12th century, purportedly from Queen Sibylla of Jerusalem. This is probably a forgery, but it's contemporary to the late 12th century. And he or she is basically, or whoever is writing it, laying the blame of the fall of Jerusalem, the fall of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, at the feet of the Byzantine emperors for not doing anything, for profiting from it. They're not trustworthy. Why am I showing you all this? I wanted to demonstrate the kind of considerations that historians take and have to think about when constructing history, and the kind of evidence they're having to use to construct their theories on which they base their interpretations. So our sources can often be partial, they can be quite fragmentary, they can be highly partisan, as we've seen. They can be missing or lost. Pity the poor kind of 9th century Italianist who only has kind of a few monastic sources who are very concerned with the plumbing of the monasteries, but not so much the wider geopolitical context. They're subjective, they're limited. So the historian's job is often to kind of construct the most plausible narrative from evidence that is often limited in a whole variety of ways. People who live through history don't always tell it well, they don't have the benefit of hindsight. That's not to say that objective history can't exist. Like from those sources we can pull out a few examples of, there are definitely Byzantine emperors. They model themselves on Rome. They have difficult relations with the West. Those are facts that we can kind of determine through the repetition in the sources. But the meaning of those events, the meaning of what we're seeing, varies highly based on the source. Now, most of us, I assume, are not historians. We are game designers. We're not working towards a PhD. But we should feel empowered by kind of the subjectivity of the historical record to be selective in what we present, to be creative and to think and make choices about what perspectives we're foregrounding in the games we're making, to kind of think about the kind of stories we're showcasing, which kind of version of events, which meaning do we want to put forward when presenting real history. Now, to take that from kind of the quite abstract to the particular, and this is kind of for talking about choosing a setting in which to base your world, to kind of choose a historical setting as your backdrop. For us, when we kind of created Fallen London and the Fallen London universe, London was, and Victorian London specifically, was an obvious choice for us for two reasons, and they're kind of intertwined. One of which was the familiarity that we had. Everyone who has worked on the game at some point has either been British or lived in London, and that familiarity with the city, even though we're not Victorians, bleeds through into the text and lets it feel more authentic. Because if you know what it feels like to be by the Thames, if you know kind of like there are noses in Soho when you walk past and they have a story, that's something that can be translated into Fallen London, and it kind of gives it, as I say, that veneer of authenticity. It also is for us, because we're English speakers, because there is so much media, popular media, about the Victorian period, and so much contemporary literature has survived and is still very readable, is still very accessible to us from the Victorian period, that gives us that ease of access that kind of lowers the bar for entry when it comes to writing about the Victorians and Victorian London specifically. That's not to say you can only write about what you know. If you're kind of writing a game about ancient Rome, I would presume you're not an ancient Roman, though if you are, well done. But it's kind of thinking about kind of what do I have, what do I know, that will kind of lower the bar to entry for me when thinking about my game, when constructing the world in which my player is going to engage. If I know Latin, if I kind of have some interest in the subject, if I've been to Rome, if I know Rome, those are kind of things that just make what you don't know easier to approach and easier to frame and think about kind of what do I need. Because if you don't know anything about a subject, obviously the bar for beginning to write about it meaningfully and authentically becomes much more difficult. But okay, so you've chosen your historical setting. The next thing to do is kind of think about, well, when? It's not enough to just say I'm making a medieval game for the most part. Going specific kind of helps you differentiate your game and tell better stories. For us, we chose the 1890s for London for a variety of reasons. Our game for London is captured by bats in 1851. We didn't start them for a couple of reasons. One of which is that's a lot of drama to put on the player at the start of the game. A lot of things to introduce, a lot of weirdness to kind of put in front of the player at the start of the game. By the time we get to kind of the 1890s, that kind of weirdness and the uncanny has seeped into the setting a little bit. And it's very important tonally for us that there's that mundane and weird kind of sitting side by side. That's the tone of the game we wanted to put across. And so kind of you've got robbery men as neighbours, and yes, hell is on your doorstep, but also you can sit down for kippers and tea. And that is the atmosphere we wanted for Fallen London. It's also kind of the 1890s as a historical setting, as a piece of real history. The themes and the kind of things that were going on in that period were what we wanted or felt chimed thematically with Fallen London, because the 1890s are kind of a time of anxiety. It's turn of the century. It's a kind of society not quite sure where it is, which obviously for us, Fallen London had become very unsure of its setting, being surrounded by hell and underground, and was going through quite a lot of anxiety about its place in the world. So there was kind of thematic consonance between what was happening in London at the time and our setting. And also kind of in terms of the popular imagination, the 1890s are a time of decadence and absinthe and Oscar Wilde, and that's something we thought was fun and we wanted to play with. And it meant we could kind of tell stories about the 1890s specifically, not just the Victorian period. We could think about kind of, well, what's going on politically, what's going on in terms of the literature, what's going on in terms of culture that we can kind of use and transpose to Fallen London, and that gives it a strength to the writing and the specificity and the level of detail and the depth that allows us to kind of differentiate ourselves from other Victorian media. So thinking about what can you do specifically in this exact moment of history that you couldn't do anywhere else is important for us when choosing a setting. It's also worth thinking about what does my audience expect when they come to this kind of setting? Are we meeting those expectations? What do they know? So for us, kind of Victorian literature and popular culture and like period dramas are really prevalent in the UK. So we kind of, and America as well, so we knew our audience would come with certain conceptions of what being a Victorian was and what being alive in the Victorian period might have been like. And so we wanted to meet them because part of the appeal of Fallen London is there's the weirdness, but we're also saying Victorian, but we're saying, yes, there's all of this oddness happening around the margins, but the Victorians are the kind of thing, the familiar, the thing to anchor yourself by, and the stars to steer by in our setting to kind of help you comprehend all of the uncanniness and all of the weird elements around it. And so we tried to meet those expectations in terms of what people might think of when they think of Victorian literature, Victorian culture. We did that by, at the start of Fallen London, you're raising kind of several stats, like you're shadowy and you're persuasive and you're watchful, which are kind of represent different aspects of your character. And they tie to kind of seduction, charming people, or being stealthy and pickpocketing. I'll just abandon that word. Deduction and learning things. And so the early game experience, you're building up those stats in locations that are keyed to a particular stat. So while you're raising your persuasive skill, you might be kind of mingling with poets, drinking wine. This is one of our starting areas, Vale Garden. And so you can see kind of the list of options to you. There's some shady characters in the bar. You can start working on some poetry. You can go to the Singing Mandrake, this pub. Those are kind of like Victorian, kind of louche, debauched activities you can get involved in this area. Another area you might be kind of solving cases with our equivalent of Sherlock Holmes, or you might be kind of running with urchins in a kind of Dickensian underworld. And so giving the player what they want, giving them something familiar for which to ground the rest of our setting by. But we did want to make changes. We didn't want to kind of present things just as people expected them to. And so thinking about what do you change and what might you need to change is important when considering your audience, your setting, and your game itself. So for us, the obvious point of divergence, our game was obviously going to change history because the Victorians never went to space. London was never stolen by bats. From the outset, we kind of had to telegraph to people, okay, this isn't different, and that's in the very, very core concept of our game. But more seriously than that, making the game playable. So our games, as you saw from the previous slide, are extremely text-heavy. Our other game, Sunless Skies, there is more going on. It's not just text. There is combat and trading and resource management. But it's a lot of text. And so we didn't want to replicate Victorian prose exactly. We didn't want to give people the expectation of what they might think of when they think of Victorian writing, which can be quite lengthy, can kind of go around the houses, can have a lot of sub-clauses. That's not always true, that's not always the fairest assessment, but that's the popular imagination when it comes to that kind of writing. And we thought kind of the burden to player enjoyment on being presented with that much text would kind of, if you're just playing for 10 minutes in your lunch break, if you're kind of dodging enemies or kind of having to like monitor your fuel and your supplies, you're going to kind of get bored, you're going to kind of lose interest, you're going to get stuck and just switch off from our game. So we kind of keep our prose short and punchy where we can. So for us, it's about conjuring up the illusion of Victorian literature, Victorian prose. And we do that in a couple of ways. One of which is just avoiding references, anachronisms, editing our work for anything that feels out of period, that kind of references something that just wasn't around or a phraseology at the time. And it's also sometimes just using a certain archness of tone, a certain irony of tone that kind of distances the player and kind of makes people think they're listening to kind of an authentic Victorian voice. And finally, sometimes it's just about word choice, sometimes just dropping in like a proper $5 Victorian word like chicanery into a sentence will sell the whole page for you, and people think, great, that's Victorian. It's also thinking kind of in terms of what your audience wants from your game, and sometimes being willing to sacrifice historical accuracy for their enjoyment. So for us, inclusivity is an important part of our game. This is the opening of Fallen London, and you can see, well, the text isn't great, but you can get the gist. There are 3 gender options. You're asked to kind of define your character's terms of address, how the game will speak to them, which can range from anything from Madame, my lord, to comrade, and captain, and bishop. And your portrait is a silhouette, it's a cameo. So, and some of those are purposefully quite neutral, like you can't tell who's under the diving helmet. And the purpose there is so the player can kind of be who they want to be in our setting. And we know from kind of what our audience tells us that that's really important to them. They come to our game sometimes to kind of express themselves in a way they can't always outside of our game. At the same time, people also come to our game because they want the Victorian Gothic experience. They want to kind of feel like they're playing a kind of proper Victorian in Victorian London. Historically, Victorian London and Victorian society in general is not particularly known for being egalitarian. It was exploitative internally and externally to fuel its industry, to fuel its empire. And Gothic literature plays on those tropes and kind of accentuates prejudice, particularly 19th century Gothic literature. So how do we reconcile those two competing needs of what our audience wants? We did that in a number of ways, one of which was kind of allowed by the fact our setting was so different. So there are devils running around and they want your soul. There are rubbery men with tentacles. And so we kind of show Victorian prejudice going outward towards these groups who don't represent and don't match onto minority experience in any way, but they're showing to the player this society is still prejudiced and it's still kind of an aspect of the setting without kind of directly implicating the player in that prejudice. It was also kind of sometimes using some of our lore elements to kind of as metaphors and to push the horror of how Victorians process things just that bit further. So one example is we have a substance called red honey, which you can smoke and have amazing lurid dreams. And that's something the upper classes in our setting kind of get a lot of use out of. And it sounds fun at first. As the player kind of uses it and digs into it, they discover those experiences are done through digging through someone's memories. And the person having that done to them can feel it and is screaming and begging to stop. And so that's kind of that chain of kind of distance between consumption and exploitation and the kind of extremity of it reflects in some ways kind of some Victorian kind of narcotic use, like opium, laudanum, cocaine, and how those are exploited and used in Victorian history. And finally, we also kind of just shifted our lens a little bit to focus on some elements of Victorian prejudice over others. So we really wanted to lean into the class-based system, the kind of rigid hierarchies that define the Victorian upper class and how they relate to everyone below them, to kind of focus on industrial rights, labour tensions, political anarchy as a movement. Those are elements we wanted to foreground. And again, we did this with the idea that we wanted to preserve some aspects of that kind of Victorian horror and that kind of Victorian realism for exploitation, while also making the game and ensuring the game was still enjoyable for our players who came to us with different needs. And this is kind of still true if you're not, say, making a fully historical game. So you just want to use a bit of history as a reference point, something to use for world building, something to kind of help you understand a piece of world building and kind of provide the inspiration for it, or to kind of help the player dropping in a historical reference in a game that is otherwise a completely new setting. So there are kind of two things we use to think about that and measure that when we talk about using reference points. And those are consonants, which is, does the use of the real history enhance the piece of fiction it's being employed in? Does it work thematically? Is it illuminating the narrative or occupying a similar space to the thing that's being referenced? Or context, which is kind of what does the player need to know to understand it? Where is the player in the game? What's the burden for entry on the player for understanding this thing if we're using real history to frame it? I'll give you two examples to help elucidate that point. We have a port in Sunless Skies. Sunless Skies is our game of Victorians in space, called New Winchester. And the premise of it is it's this newly independent settler place. It's thrown off the shackles of London. It's a hive of industry and smog and hubbub, and it's very working class. When we first conceived of it, we named all of its streets after pretenders to the English throne. So people like Bonnie Prince Charlie, Lady Jane Grey. Because we thought it kind of reflected the newly independent nation that we wanted to represent here. We cut that for a couple of reasons, one of which was the burden of information on the player was quite strong because they don't know at what point our history has diverged from real history. So for all they know, those people could have been kings and queens in our setting legitimately. That's if they know who they are. They might not. If you're not a student of British history, why would you know who these people are? So it's an extra burden of a history where the player has to think, do I need to know this information? Is this important? That's kind of getting in the way of what we want to show, which is the port. And finally, the references just weren't strong enough. They were kind of almost clashing with the port character that we wanted to convey. We wanted it to be kind of working class industrial, but these references are still monarchist. They just disagree about who's on the throne. They're still quite antiquarian, they're scholarly. It didn't get across the port's character in a way that we found useful. In contrast, we found kind of using, for Sunless Skies, we needed to implement an alternate trading system that would involve smuggling illicit goods around the Sunless Skies. And we used as a reference point for that, for the faction that did that, who were called the Gentlemen. Our reference for that was 18th century smugglers and wreckers, who, although kind of distant in history from the period we were using, occupied a similar space. They were high risk. They were networks of kind of secrecy and silence. They involved kind of all word of mouth to kind of convey goods across a vast distance. And things we found really useful for them was they had such a strong system of trust, and they used particular oaths. They used thieves' oaths to signal and signify bonds and to kind of mark debts and to kind of convey trust. And that kind of provided for us the perfect way to represent this faction, this new bit of world building, the Gentlemen, to our player in a way that hopefully was comprehensible to them if they had to earn their trust. And it kind of just framed how we introduced them to the player in the game and how they would then interact with the Gentlemen. They wouldn't be presented with the system up front. They would have to earn the Gentleman's trust and become known to them and know some of their customs in order to open up this whole new system in the game. So a good rule of thumb when considering borrowing history is always, can the player understand it? Can the player understand the game and what's going on without being aware of the thing being referenced or the thing you're using as a reference? And this is true for making your game history relevant, telling the player what they need to know to understand your game at the outset. So for us, we had not only, when we started Sunless Skies at the very opening, we had a lot of history we could have potentially conveyed to them, because not only was there the Victorian realm to understand, there were kind of several games of backstory. There was Fallen London stolen by bats, and there was Sunless Sea, and now Sunless Skies, and now they're in space, and they're captain of a space train. It's a lot to process. So we had to decide, make a quick decision to be utterly ruthless. So there are very, very few references to Fallen London in Sunless Skies, because we thought the burden of information to new players was just too high and just kind of bogged players down in details they didn't really know or weren't hugely relevant to the game, and certainly not at the start of play. So all we tell the player at the outset of the game in quite a limited tutorial space, and it's limited because not only are they being talked about the world history, the game history, they also have to understand how to move the engine, how to fight, how to manage their supplies. So not a lot of space at all. So we kind of boiled it down to just, you're in a space train. Yes, it is a train. You're captain. Now, Queen Victoria rules the skies. Yes, it's definitely space. Go. And that was just kind of being ruthless with what the player needed to know. We also looked for opportunities in the game to kind of get some of that information across while the player was doing something else. So our character creation here, you're not just choosing your kind of portrait, what you look like, and your stats. You're also choosing your backstory. And these options, like soldier, poet, have sub-choices. Now, as you can see, the text here is really short. But those nested sub-choices, again, are very, very short, but they'll offer you a choice. So if you choose soldier, you'll be asked, you fought in the Winchester War, whose side did you fight on? So in that kind of small moment, you're understanding there was a war, there were two sides to it, and getting a little bit of detail, all while you're doing something else in the game, which is creating your character. So when you start the game, you have a bit of perspective and a bit of context for the game world that's unique to your character. Finally, it's also a point of thinking about what's fun to discover versus what needs to be explained. I imagine you're getting the impression that our games are very baroque. They're very dense in their lore. And so an aspect of our game history that was crucial to Sunless Skies was that ours, time, is a commodity, something that can be mined, something that can be refined. It fuels the empire and the technology that you're seeing, and it was kind of the backbone for many of our quests in the game, the use and misuse of hours. We wound up going back and forth on whether or not we should tell players what hours are up front, how it works. We wound up coming down on the idea that we should, because the concept of mining hours, the concept of using hours in that way, is so weird and so baroque that the rest of the game was just incomprehensible if we didn't make some smart choices about where to kind of pull back the veil and just tell people up front this information that you need to know to understand a lot of the rest of our game. But this is kind of all for the outset. Let's say you have kind of a rich game history that you want to get across. You want your player to engage with it. You don't want them to just kind of find lore books and read it and just consign it to the pages there. You want it to kind of have an effect on the world in which the player is moving through. But also kind of, you don't know for us where the player is or what point they're going to discover information. So kind of conveying a huge amount of game history for us was quite a challenge. And we had a few methods for going about that. One of which was just repeating information. Our games are generally non-linear. So we're never sure when a player encounters a piece of information, if this is the first time they found it, or if this is kind of, they're old hat to them, they already know what it is. So we kind of tried to vary information and showed it in different contexts when the player found it. An example of that, part of our game history is there's this company that rules the hours trade, and it is a proxy for London, and it's quite ruthless. And so there were two ports you can find early on that show different aspects of this company. One, Port Prosper, is kind of the company town, it's genteel. The Hour is kind of refractory, kind of exploits people horribly, but that's genteel and off to the side. You can only find that if you go digging for it. The other end of the spectrum is Lustrum, which is where the raw hours are mined, and the company keeps an iron hand over its settlers and its miners. And so the player can go to both of these and see kind of the same information, that there is a company, they control hours, they don't have a great relationship with the settlers, and they're beholden to London. But the context in which you see it is completely different, and the perspective that the player might then form is different. It's also worth thinking about kind of the proximity, what else is going on when the player encounters a bit of information. So for us, kind of juxtaposing different bits, inviting the player to make contrasts by the fact that some information is encountered in a roughly similar place, kind of adds depth, encourages them to kind of form perspectives based on what they're seeing. So at Port Prosper, you might kind of meet the chairman of the company. He might send you out on quests for industrial espionage, bounty hunting, kind of the settlers' ships. At the same time, you might get an invite to the factory, and depending on your relationships with other people in that factory and in the port as a whole, you get very different views of that factory and what's going on and the Wimber Company's role in it. And finally, there is a settler quest, and these are randomly generated, but some of the settlers occasionally might kind of come to you with a random event saying, by the way, I'm a fugitive from the Wimber Company, your crew's found out, please don't make me go back, help me escape. And the player is then presented with a choice, and either they already have dealings with the Wimber Company, they already have a perspective, the Wimber Company has been helpful to them in the past, in which case they might want to help her. Or they've had bad dealings with them, they don't like them, they don't enjoy their company, so they decide to help her. Or they might have no opinion on the Wimber Company, this might be the first time they've really encountered a negative perspective or really understood what it was, and now they're currently being asked to make a choice. And that choice then might colour how they deal with the company elsewhere in the game next time they have to make a choice like this. It's kind of a process of letting the player kind of slowly build up through a series of choices how they find the game, and depending on the context in which they discover that choice, their perspective might shift radically. Or it might not, or they might kind of go straight down, I hate the Wimber Company, all the way through the game. That's also a valid option. There's letting players form opinions based on your game history through kind of a slow accumulation of knowledge throughout the game. And my final kind of point here is showing your game history through making the consequences of it relevant to your world. Show what it's like to live with the effects of your game's history reverberating throughout your setting. Show it in kind of the locations they move through, like the physical experience of traveling through your game world. Have that be affected by the game history. Inform character motivations, the quests they make, the choices that you have to make, even the kind of makeup of your enemies, and have them express perspectives on that history. So an example of that for us was we have a region in the game called Eleutheria, which is pitch black. None of our other regions are pitch black. It's dark, it's gloomy. The enemies that kind of you encounter there operate using light and darkness as ways to kind of get at you. The reason for that is the sun at the center of the region has turned off its light. Our suns are sentient beings, they control natural and physical law as expressed through their light. So when it turns off its light, all law is suspended in this region. And the reason for that is it's grieving. It's grieving its twin that was killed centuries ago in terms of when our game starts. But that then grief, that seeps through and infects the physical landscape the player is moving through. It affects the kind of makeup of the characters who've been allowed to thrive there, the factions that the player is able to encounter, meet with, the storylines they will present them with. There are prisons where kind of servants of the sun have been thrown in because they refuse to change, and they want to escape, or other people want to make sure they never escape. And so there'll be rescue missions into that prison. And the kind of context for everything that's happened there is generated from something that's happened a long time ago in your setting. So the player is learning through kind of encountering all of this history that is kind of being made relevant through the way that people are now interacting, the way that people are trying to move the star to kind of continue its war. People are trying to petition it for various things. So the kind of living world that they're in, that kind of now, is all inflected by what's already gone on in the setting way before the player ever encountered it, down to the very physical experience of moving through it. And this is just a screenshot of Eleutheria. As you can see, kind of it's dark, it's gloomy, you can't ignore kind of the effect of the lack of light in this region. And that kind of huge crab thing is a port that was once a servant that's being kind of cast down and blown up. And so a lot of the quests around that port are to do with kind of literally doing archaeology, digging into its bones to learn its secrets. So in conclusion then, to kind of wrap everything up, history obviously is a complex topic, and it can be a complete rabbit hole to go down. You need to be thinking about the choices you make when you use real history, the story you're telling, and what your game needs. But you should also feel empowered by the fact that, as we've seen, history is kind of a matter of perspective, it's a matter of narrative. It's something kind of you can make choices on in terms of what you show and how you show it. And kind of a guide for that is using your audience, keeping in mind what they might want from a game in using real history, what they kind of might be interested in, what will kind of make the game worse for them, and being empowered to make smart choices about kind of the kind of things to show and the kind of things to keep back and which bits of real history to foreground. And kind of that audience-led perspective also works when you're considering your kind of game history, how to convey it in a way that kind of makes it relevant, interesting, and engaging for the player in a way that keeps it from being background but makes it part of your living game experience. And I think that's everything I have time for, but thank you very much.
Any question?
Hello. I was thinking about something I found in other games. It's about these audio messages that you found in some place or exploring level. What do you think about this kind of audio design, audio narrative design?
We are obviously kind of very textual, so audio doesn't feature a huge amount in our games, but we kind of use sound design to kind of convey people certain kind of aspects of the setting. So we have an enemy called the scribe spinsters, who are made of wood and were fashioned centuries back in our history. So we kind of use sound design to convey how old they feel and how kind of rusty and how kind of miserable and in pain they were, because you can't talk to them. There is no text for them, they just exist to kind of try and kill you. So he wants to convey that backstory through the kind of sounds and the physicality of that enemy.
Hello. Thanks for the presentation. It was very interesting. In the process of designing the story, how were you working with the game designer? Maybe you were the game designer as well. Were you working hand in hand with him, or it was a process going back and forth with the game design aspect? Because it sounds very heavy and dense, all the constraints you put with history in your design. So how does game design relate to this? When we created kind of regions for Sunless Skies, we sat down with kind of different people on the team, like an artist and a Unity expert to a programmer, to implement the region and kind of think about their makeup and think about kind of what assets we had, what kind of agents there would be moving around the space, where things would be in relation to each other, and then the kind of atmosphere and the appearance of that setting. And so we tried to convey kind of a sense of geography, a kind of sense of these things are interconnected by the fact that they're related to each other, the fact they're close to each other on the map. So we tried to kind of make sure that our history is being conveyed not just in the text, but in kind of the actual physical makeup of the world in which the player was moved through.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I was asking myself about the preparation. Are you preparing all the story and then the story of the game itself, or is it you have a storyline and then you adapt the story in consequence?
Okay, so we've been going for 10 years, so our approach is probably not helpful to everyone. We have kind of like mountains and mountains and mountains of lore built up over the years, so sometimes it's a bit like archaeology. But there was kind of some stuff was done at the outset, like Sunless Skies, we decided, space captains quite early, we decided that the stars were dying, that London was in space, and how Queen Victoria had gotten there were all very early things. But a lot of like the specifics, a lot of kind of the actual makeup of the ports you encounter, a lot of the characters, a lot of how they kind of then fit into this world, and a lot of kind of the histories of the stars, we kind of discovered through slowly kind of working on the game, and then figuring out, well, what are we missing, what gaps have we got, and then kind of seeing where things could fill in a way that felt natural. So it was a bit of kind of preparation and a lot of kind of putting the tracks just before the train as it was moving.
Thank you.